Hi, welcome to lesson 6 of our Primavera P6. So here we're going to be learning how to create relationships. So when we talk about relationships in Primavera P6, relationships simply means how are the tasks dependent on one another? Which one do we need to finish before we start another? Or which one needs to end before another one begins? So in Primavera P6, Primavera makes mention or identifies 4 major types of relationships that can be created. And the 4 major types of relationships that we have are, number 1, we have the finish to start relationship. Finish to start simply means that the predecessor activity must finish. So let's say this is activity A, that's the predecessor. So A has to finish before the next activity will start. And so this is the successor activity, that's activity B. So finish to start simply means that A must finish before B can start. So this is a vivid example of what a finish to start relationship looks like. So if, for example, we're looking at the building, which we're using as an example here, don't forget that we may choose to create a finish to start relationship between clearing and excavating. So we can first of all say that we have to clear the site first before we do excavating, or foundation and superstructure. So we have to do the foundation first before we can do superstructure. So that's what we call a finish to start relationship. So aside from a finish to start relationship, activities can also have what we call a start to start relationship. So start to start relationship in most cases refer to activities that overlap. So when we say that activities have a start to start relationship, it simply means that these activities overlap one way or the other in the course of the project implementation. So start to start simply means that activity A, which is the predecessor, must start before B can start. And that's what a start to start relationship illustrates. So if you look at some of the exercises we've used, don't forget, a vivid example of start to start relationship can be writing and editing. So note that before editing can start, writing has to start. So that's why it's called a start to start relationship. So when we start writing, that's when editing can start. But then writing doesn't necessarily need to finish before editing can start. So because as we write, we can be editing. Even in movies production, also as we shoot, we also edit. So that can also be a start to start relationship. Then activities can also have what we call a finish to finish relationship. Finish to finish relationship simply means that the predecessor activity must finish before the successor activity can finish. So you have activity A, activity B. So A must finish before B can finish. That's a vivid example of what a finish to finish relationship talks about. So notice that usually most start to start relationships can also qualify as finish to finish relationships. Remember we talked about writing and editing. So if we use the same example for finish to finish, writing has to finish before editing can finish. I mean, the editor can't say I've finished editing when the writer is still writing, for example. Or the movie example we use, don't forget that, the shooting of the movie has to finish before the editing can finish. So that's what we call a finish to finish relationship. But don't forget that these activities run concurrently at some point. Then the last one, which is rarely used, is what we now refer to as a start to finish relationship. Start to finish relationship. So in start to finish relationship, we're simply saying that the predecessor activity must start before the successor activity can finish. That's a start to finish relationship. Or we're simply saying that any of these activities must start before the next one finishes. So in other words, start to finish simply means that A must start before B can finish. This is a start to finish relationship. So let's say shift workers, for example. Before those who are currently working on a session can finish, the next session has to start. And that's essentially how it goes on and on and on and on. So that's a start to finish relationship. So this relationship is usually used when, you have activities that will run round the clock. Say, for example, you're doing a 24-hour work. Before a particular activity finishes, the next activity has to start. And that's essentially what we refer to as start to finish relationship. So these are the 4 primary types of relationships that we have in Primavera P6, and that's what we're going to be learning exactly how to do using the Primavera P6 software. So remember, we said activities can either have a finish to start relationship, that the predecessor has to finish before the successor starts, or a start to start relationship, that means the predecessor has to start before the successor starts, or a finish to finish relationship, that means the predecessor must finish before the successor can start, or a start to finish relationship, that means the predecessor must start before the successor can finish. Those are the 4 types of relationships that we are going to be looking at. Okay, so as usual, we'll begin by signing into our Primavera P6, and then it takes us straight into the very last project that we are working on. Okay, so here we are. So remember, in the last lesson, we actually entered our project activities, and this is some of the project, or these are the project activities that we entered in the last lesson together with their durations. And like we said, in this very lesson, we're going to be learning how to create relationships that, exist between our project activities. Alright, so part of the first activities relationships we are going to be creating is between the first activity and the second one. That's activity A1000 and activity A1010. So let's say activity A1000 and activity A1010 has a finish to start relationship. So one way we can create our activities is we can choose to do so from the command bar by clicking on the assign predecessors button that you have there. So if I click on it, you can see the assign predecessors window shows up. Another way I can do that is I can add a predecessor column here simply by going to columns in my taskbar, and then I can go to available options and click on find. Then under the find portion, I type in predecessor, and then I click on enter. So I'm looking for predecessors, not predecessor details. So I can click on enter again until it gets to predecessors. Then I can close the find window and add the predecessors to the already displayed columns that I have in my timeline. So I want the predecessors to be right after the remaining duration. Yeah, so let it be right after the remaining duration. So I want it to be in between the remaining duration and then also starts date of our activity. So if I click on apply, it shows up here in between those two. So I click on OK. Alright, so now that I've been able to display, okay, let me expand this a little bit so it's a bit more conspicuous. Okay, good. So now that I've been able to display my predecessor column, in order for me to assign a predecessor to an activity, say for example, design building layout, I can simply, under the predecessor column in the cell for that very activity, double click on the cell for that activity. It will also bring up the assign predecessors window for me. So don't forget, I've shown you how we can go about this the first time, which is by clicking on the assign predecessors icon in the command bar. Then I also showed you how to add predecessors column, and when you double click in that cell, you're going to also see the assign predecessors window. Another way to do this is to also do it from the detail view. So under the detail view, notice that I have predecessors, I have successors, I also have relationships. Don't forget that, so let me raise this up a bit. Don't forget that in the previous lesson, I showed you how to add tabs in your detail view. So just in case you've forgotten, just right click on the detail view, then click on customize, and then choose whatever tab you want to add. And say for example, I want to add this very task, and then click on the single arrow, then it gets added. So if I click on apply now, you will see that my work products and documents get displayed. Let's say I want to remove this. I select the one I want to remove, and then I click on the back arrow. If I click on the apply button, you can see successors here get removed. So but I'm going to be adding it back because I'm going to be needing it. So I want my successor to be right below my predecessors. Okay, so I click on OK. So that's how to display these tabs, just in case you've lost touch about how to display the tab. So if I click on the predecessor tab, you notice that below I have an assign button. If you're not seeing the assign button, simply drag your detail view and drag it up a little bit, so it will show you the assign button below. So if I click on that assign button, it also shows me the assign predecessors window as well. And then I can also do that from the relationship part. So if I click on the relationship tab in the detail view, you will notice that by my left I have predecessors, and then I have successors by my right. So if I want to assign predecessors, I can simply click on the assign button as well, and it brings up the assign predecessors window for me. So whichever one you choose to use is quite okay, and we're going to be assigning predecessors. So make sure you are in the relationships tab in the detail view, so that as you assign the predecessors, you're going to be seeing it for each of the activities that you are assigning. Aside from that, it's also going to be displayed here in our predecessors column, and then also we're going to see the relationship in form of arrow in your Gantt as well. So again, let's display our assign predecessors window. So simply by clicking on the predecessors in the command bar, and then it brings up this window. Alright, so I usually like bringing my window down here so that it doesn't cover activities I have on my timeline. And then I also like to resize it so that it's a bit more conspicuous. So just in case yours is not showing very well, don't forget you can choose to resize. You can choose to resize it so that you can display exactly the information you want. Okay, so if you notice, something exciting is happening here. In the assign predecessors windows, the activities you're seeing here are the exact same activities you're seeing in your timeline. So that's also what is being displayed here in the assign predecessors window. So just like the name suggests, assign predecessors simply means that this is a window we are going to be using to assign predecessors to activities that we have in our timeline. So predecessor simply means which activity comes before that very activity. So that's essentially what the predecessors actually represent. Alright, so for the very first activity that we're going to be assigning a predecessor to, that's our design building layout. Don't forget, the initiate building system is the very first activity. So, because it's the first activity, it won't have a predecessor. Remember I said predecessor, which activity comes before it. And therefore, so we'll start from the second activity, which is design building layout. So it now has a predecessor, which is initiate building. So to create a relationship between these, I first of all click on the design building layout in my timeline, and then I go to the assign predecessors window and click on the design, and then click on initiate building. And then I click on initiate building. Okay, so but if you notice, my activities are not well sorted here. I think they are sorted according to the activity name, but I want them to be sorted according to the activity ID. So let me sort according to activity ID. So I'm sorting according to activity ID simply by clicking on the activity ID and make sure the arrow there is pointing downwards. Okay, so they are well sorted now. So I want to assign a predecessor to design building layout. So I click on design building layout in my timeline, which is what I've just done. Click on design building layout in my timeline. Then I come to the assign predecessors window, and then I select initiate building, and then I click on the assign button. That's the green button you're seeing here by the right hand side of the assign predecessors window. So watch what happens in the predecessors cell, and then also in the relationship portion of my detail view the moment I click on assign. So if I click on assign, it gets assigned. So you can see it's telling me that this design building layout activity is dependent on A1000, and A1000 is initiate building, and that's also the same information that is displayed here. Then also, if you take a look at my Gantt, you will notice that there's an arrow showing the relationship that I've just created. So just in case your arrow is not showing, you might need to check your tools bar and then go to the relationship lines. Don't forget, you can choose to turn off the arrow. If I click on that relationship lines, you can see the arrow disappears. So just in case your arrow is not showing, you might need to go to your tools bar and then turn on the relationship lines. So I've created a finish to start relationship between these two activities. So if you come to my detail view now, under the relationship tab, under relationships for this activity, you notice that it's showing me FS. FS simply means this is a finish to start relationship. So by default, for every relationship you create, Primavera ascribes a finish to start relationship to it because that's the most common type of relationship. So next, I'm going to create a start to start relationship between design building and design building layout. So I click on design building here, and then I go to assign predecessors window and select design building layout, and then I click on assign. So the moment I do that, you can see it assigns A1010 as the predecessor to A1020. In other words, the predecessor to design building layout is design building. But remember, I told you that the relationship type is start to start relationship, but by default here I have a finish to start relationship. So to change that, I click in this cell where I have the FS. So if I click on it, it drops. So you will see those 4 types of relationships that I made mention of earlier on. And that's the finish to start, the finish to finish, finish to start to finish, and start to start. So because this is a start to start relationship, I select start to start. So if I select start to start, it changes to a start to start relationship. Now next, I'm going to create a relationship between M&E design and then also design building. So of course, we need the building design to enable us design the mechanical and then also the electrical. So I select the M&E design, and then I click on the design building, and then I click on the assign button. So this is a finish to start relationship. So I'm going to be leaving it at a finish to start relationship. Then the M&E design and the plumbing will run concurrently. So in other words, I'm going to create a relationship between the M&E design and the plumbing design. So that's going to be a start to start relationship. So I select the plumbing design, and then I select the M&E, and then I click on the assign button. And then under the relationship type, don't forget, you can see my arrow here is showing a finish to start relationship between M&E and then plumbing design. But when I change the relationship type to start, watch what happens to the arrow. So you can see the arrow now changes it to a start to start relationship. And that's what we have just done. So the approval will not be dependent on that these our designs are ready. And therefore, it means our approval is going to be dependent on activity. That's the design building, the M&E design, and then also the plumbing design. So I click on approval here, and then I click on design building. I hold down my control button. I click on the M&E design as well as the plumbing design. So this is how to create multiple relationships, just in case you want to do that. Then I click on the assign button. So you can see the moment I do that, it shows me those multiple relationships that I have created. And then of course they all get displayed here. So we've created relationships between activities that exist in our design work package. Sometimes there might be a mistake. Say for example, you add another activity out of error. Let's say I make a mistake of adding plumbing design more than once. So you can see there are 3 relationships here. So let's say I add another relationship to this design approval. That's also plumbing. So you can see I have 2 plumbing design here. So one is showing finish to finish, the other one is showing finish to start. So I really do not need this one. So in order to remove the one I don't want, I simply select it by clicking on it, and then I click on this remove button here. So if I click on remove, it will ask me if I'm sure I want to remove this activity. So I click on yes, so you can see it gets removed. So just in case you add some activities by error, this is essentially how to remove any relationship that you created erroneously. Okay, so for our procurement work packages, let's say all the activities here would have a finish to start relationship. So the planned procurement, of course, will be dependent on the 1050. That is the approval of our building design. So in other words, I select planned procurement here, and then I go to my assign predecessors window, and then I select design approval, and then I click on the assign button. Then the other ones would all have a finish to start relationship with that, or the other activities under procurement will all have a finish to start relationship. So I select advertise for bid, then I select plan procurement here, and then I assign. Then I also select conduct bidder conference, and then advertise for bid, and then I also assign. Then conduct vendor bid analysis, and then is dependent on conduct bidder conferences. And then also select vendor is dependent on, the outcome of our vendor bid analysis. And then assign, and then inspect procured item will be dependent on, the selected vendor, and then, the content that we have in our procurement plan. So I hold my control button, and then I click on the plan procurement, and then I click on, the assign button. So I've created relationships also between activities that I have in my, procurement work package. So next, I'm also going to do exactly the same thing for activities under the foundation work package. So of course, foundation clearing will be dependent on the design approval. So once we get approval, then clearing can start. So I click on clearing, and then I go to design approval, and then I click on assign. So this is a finish to start relationship. Then setting out, of course, after we've done the clearing, so I click on set out, and then under the assign predecessors window, I select clearing, and then I click on assign. Then excavating will be dependent on, of course, after we've set out. So I select excavating in my timeline, then select set out in my assign predecessors window, and then I click on assign. Then blinding will be dependent on, of course, excavating. So I select blinding in my timeline, then I select excavating in the assign predecessors window, and then I assign. Then block work is dependent on the outcome of the blinding. So I select blinding here, and then I assign. And then filling is going to be at the end of the block work. So I select filling, then block work here, and then I assign. Then of course slab is going to be at the end of both the block work and as well as the filling. So I select slab, and then I select and then slab is going to be at the end of the filling. So I select slab, and then I select filling here, and then I assign. So once you're done with the assignments, you can close the assign predecessors window. So the moment you do that, you will notice that Primavera creates these relationships for you in the Gantt, and you're going to see those relationships typically displayed. Just in case your Gantt is not very conspicuous, you can zoom on it, so you can see if you hover your mouse on the date, it changes like a magnifying lens. So just click and then drag. So if you drag to the right, it would expand. So you can also use the zoom button here and zoom in, and then also you can zoom out depending on exactly how you want it. Okay, so I think it's a lot more better this way. So you can see from what we have here, these green bars represent the activities, and then the black ones represent summary tasks, which is our work packages. And that's essentially what these black ones represent. So the first one is the project, and then the second one is the phase of the project, which is the building system. The third one represents the work package, which is the design work package, while this represents the milestone. These are the activities. Then this other black one, this other black bar here represents, another work package, and this other black bar here also represents another work package. Now, however, you may notice that all our activities also seem to commence, all on the same day. So once you've created your relationships, the next thing you may now choose to do is to schedule your activities. So scheduling the activities would help in stretching out the relationships on the Gantt, so you see it in a lot more better format, and then also it will automatically help you to display the activities that you have on your critical path, and then also give you some other very interesting information. So to schedule our activities, all we simply need to do is you come to the tools bar, you're going to see a schedule icon there, or you can press F9 on your keyboard, whichever you prefer. So if I click on schedule, it will bring up the schedule button. It will bring up the schedule window for me. And then under the schedule window, I can simply click on schedule there. So once I do that, you may notice that, it stretches out the activities in my Gantt and then, brings it out in a better way, and then also shows you the exact relationships that you've created. So from what we have so far, you can notice that these activities, some activities are on red. So these activities that, are colored red are now the activities on the critical path. And then critical path simply means activities on the, path with the longest duration. And that's essentially, what the critical path, helps us to do. So it therefore means that these activities on the critical path, let's ensure we do not delay them, because they are the ones that determine the project duration. And if you delay any activity on the critical path, you would inadvertently affect the project duration. Another exciting part here is you notice some of these activities are in green. So these ones that are in green are the activities that are not on the critical path. So for the benefit of some of us who may not understand what we mean by the critical path computation, let's do a little bit of illustration to be able to explain that in detail. So let's say, for example, I have two activities, and then I have activity A, and then I have activity B. So, and these activities are mutually exclusive. In other words, they are not dependent on one another, and they would all run concurrently. So if I do my network diagram, so activity A has a 10-day duration, and then activity B has, let's say, a 5-day duration. So if I do my network diagram, since these activities are not dependent on one another and they all begin at start, so I have my start button here, and then I draw my first arrow. This portion represents activity A, and then activity A has a 10-day duration. And then I also draw another arrow. So this represents activity B, and then activity B has a 5-day duration. So this is activity B. And then I now have finished, because those are the only two activities that I have in this very project. So I have finished. So this is a kind of mini network diagram to show the relationship that exists between these two activities, the fact that they run concurrently. So notice that from what I have here, I have two parts. I have the part A and then the part B. So part A has a 10-day duration. Part B has a 5-day duration. It therefore means that if these two activities run concurrently, in other words, if they have the relationship that is depicted by this network diagram, it therefore means that this project that I have here would be a 10-day duration project. So the project will last for 10 days. So that's why I told you that the path with the longest duration, that's what we now refer to as the critical path. So the critical path in this illustration that I've just done, this is critical. The critical path in this illustration I've just done is this path A, because that's the path with the longest duration. And remember, I told you that if I delay any activity on the critical path, it will affect when the project would finish. So if, for example, this activity A gets delayed, it would also affect affect the finished date of the project. So if we delay it for 1 day, the project is now going to be an 11-day project, not a 10-day project that, we had earlier on. So that's why the critical part is very necessary. Then another key term you should also note is what we now refer to as float. Float is also known as slack. So when we talk about float, float simply talks about how long an activity can be delayed without affecting the finished date of the project. And that's essentially what your total float focuses on. So in this case, if you look at activity B will be done in 5 days. In other words, it therefore means that we have a 5-day difference between activity B and then the project duration, which is 10 days. Therefore, it means that activity B can actually be delayed for up to 5 days, and then we still finish on the 10th day. So it means we can actually wait until the 5th day to start activity B and finish on the 10th day. So if we delay activity B up to 5 days, it will still not affect when the project would finish. So this amount of days that we can delay activity B without affecting the project finish date, that's what we now refer to as float. So you will notice that in our P6, these activities that have float, or these activities that are not on the critical part, those are the ones you see the bars are, green in color. And then the ones that are on the critical part, those are now the ones you're seeing, that has a red bar coloration in the Primavera P6. So that's essentially how to be able to interpret the figure that you've gotten from your Gantt. So if we take a look at those activities now that are not on the critical part, you notice that all of them will have float. So the float there tells you how long those activities can be delayed. But the activities on the critical part, if you check the float, you're going to see that all of them will have 0 float. Because, like I said, you cannot delay an activity on the critical part, and then if you delay it, it will of course affect when the project would finish. So if we go back to our Primavera P6, so you can see these ones in red are the activities on the critical part. So if I go to my timeline, for example, and then I decide to add the float column, I can right click in my Gantt, I can right click in my timeline and click on columns. Don't forget, you can also access your columns from the tools bar. Then I go to available options and then I click on find, I type in float. So you're going to notice that there are different other forms of float. You have the free float and you have the total float. However, what we're going to be looking at now is the total float. So if I select the total float, I add it to, the columns that I have in my timeline. So let the float be the last column. That's the total float, be the last column. I click on apply, then I click on OK. So now, so this is basically what I am talking about. So if you look at all the activities that are red in color, you will notice that they all have 0 float, 0 float, 0 float. Then this one in red also 0 float. But if you look at the ones in green, those are activities on the non-critical part, you notice that they all have a float. So like this plumbing design has a 3-day float. In other words, it can be delayed for 3 days. Even if it gets delayed for up to 3 days, it still not affect the project finish date. Then some have up to 50-day float. So let me compress this a little bit so it's a bit more conspicuous. So you can see the planned procurement has up to 50-day float. And then also the advertised for bid also has up to 50-day float. And then of course some of them, a whooping 50-day float. So they can we can delay one of them for up to 50 days. And then they will still not affect when the project would finish. So one thing you need to understand about the float again is the fact that when we begin to exhaust the float for each of these activities, depending on the relationship that exists between those activities, it will gradually also begin to reduce the float of the other set of activities. For example, if this advertised for bid is delayed for up to 50 days, for example, you also notice that these other floats, these other activities here would have also exhausted a 50-day duration float that they have. So that's one key thing you need to understand especially when it comes to interpreting your float. And if you look at the other activities that are on red, that's activities on the critical part, you will notice that they all have 0 float. Now, when we now talk about the free float, which is part of the things we saw the other end, free float is now how long an activity can be delayed without affecting the start date of successor activity. And that's essentially what the free float represents. So you can also choose to see your free float. Now, the essence why this is necessary is for you to know, basically for each activity now, how long can each activity be delayed so that it doesn't affect when the predecessor activity is slated to begin. So in this very lesson, we learned how to create relationship amongst our project activities. We also learned that there are 4 types of relationships, which are the finish to start, the start to start, the start to finish, and the finish to finish. We created relationships from the predecessor tab in the command bar, or from the predecessor column in the timeline. We also could do same from relationships tab in the detail view by clicking on assign, or from the predecessor tab by clicking on assign. Don't forget that also you can do this from your successor if you want to walk the other way around. And that's essentially what the successor does for you. So if you want to use successors, that means you will have to start from predecessors and then assign successors to it. So whichever way you choose to be able to assign or create relationship for your project is just fine. But most importantly, be sure you get it very well. And usually, for a beginner, you may want to first of all create your project relationships on an Excel sheet or on a piece of paper before you begin to feed it into your Primavera P6 so that it would work effectively for you. I wish you the best in your scheduling career. I hope this particular session has been very informative for you. So in the next lesson, which is lesson 7, we're going to learn how to create our calendars, and then also how to tweak our calendars and make our project have a real world reflection. I hope this particular video has been very informative for you. For me, it's quite exciting, and I want to thank you so much for listening. Bye.